This is an assessment of poverty through the lens of choice by Emma Batty and Shaylin Ainsworth. When discussing poverty, it is essential to first understand what poverty is. Therefore, we must ask ourselves the question, how is poverty defined? The Merriam-Webster definition of poverty is the state of one who lacks a usual or socially acceptable amount of money or material possessions. Although this is a good start to being able to define poverty, this definition is unclear, and to be honest, poverty is more complicated than you probably think. The question is complicated because poverty means different things to different people. Some claim that poverty is determined based on household income. Others may claim that poverty is a lack of basic necessities such as food, shelter, clothing, etc. Some may even argue that poverty is social and economic instability and that it can lead to the lack of freedom and to do what one wants. Discussing the perception of how poverty is defined by most Americans, it is important to understand Rector's point. Robert Rector, a research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, focuses on poverty-related issues in modern society. Rector claims that there is a mass misrepresentation of what poverty actually looks like in America. He believes that poverty is the extreme deprivation of monetary resources and basic needs like food, clothing, shelter, and utilities. This definition of poverty is very similar to what most of society believes. Rector argues that when people today hear that about 11% of the American population is living in poverty, they assume the worst conditions and that these people are homeless, living on the streets, and missing meals. While this is the case for some of the impoverished population, it is not always true. According to Rector, just because you live underneath the poverty level does not mean that you are, in his opinion, poor. Rector references statistics that show that many households that are identified as living in poverty by the U.S. government have many amenities like air conditioning, kitchen appliances, televisions, cell phones, and more. To him, this indicates that people who are supposedly living in poverty are actually doing fine. Since they're not living on the streets and they possess these amenities, it's assumed that their basic needs are satisfied as well. Thus, they are able to live a minimally decent life. But are they really? Questions like, does the person have enough money to sustain the utilities they own? And how much exertion is an individual doing to be able to afford these resources? These questions demonstrate the shortcomings of Rector's argument and how poverty is defined.
So, poverty is both defined by its denotation as well as its cultural context. However, as previously mentioned, many follow-up questions arise when attempting to define poverty based on these factors. This leads to the question on how should we define poverty as to take all these variables into consideration. It is in our opinion that poverty should be defined as the general lack of resources and capabilities required to live and to sustain a minimally decent life with the freedom of choice. Now, that's a loaded statement, so let's break that down. Let's start by explaining what resources and capabilities are. While income has universally been considered a measurement of poverty, this does not reflect an individual's access to basic resources where these certain amenities, in turn, improve a person's quality of life. Therefore, it is imperative to define poverty based on the individual's lack of resources rather than their lack of money. Like Rector, we believe that the main essential resources that needs to be considered are food, clothing, and shelter. However, we depart from Rector in that we believe that there are other certain amenities that are also necessary, such as access to internet or transportation. Due to the way our society is structured today, it is very hard, if not impossible, to find a good, well-paying, safe job without these resources. Additionally, we believe that other resources, such as the access to affordable healthcare, as well as a minimum K-12 education, are very important. However, the extent in which a person is able to obtain these resources brings us to our next point in our definition of poverty, the capabilities approach. Capabilities approach is a measurement developed by Amartya in an attempt to incorporate human welfare into measuring poverty. Rather than focusing on resources and opportunities, aka functionings being an indicator of whether or not someone may be living in poverty, the capabilities approach focuses on the actual capacity in which a person is able to obtain these resources and opportunities. An example to describe this relationship is for us to imagine a person who is fasting and then one who is starving. As Sen describes, these two people have the same nutritional functioning at the moment, but do not have the same capabilities. The person who is fasting has access to food and has the ability to not be fasting, while the person who starves simply has no choice. To quote Nussbaum, capability means the opportunity to select. It is important to include capabilities into the definition of poverty because this focuses on the opportunities people have and their right to choose. Therefore, poverty must be defined in conjunction with focusing on making sure people have the capabilities and the liberty to make their own choices.
Building off of the capabilities approach, Nussbaum developed a list of combined central capabilities to help in the measurement of human welfare into poverty. According to Nussbaum, you must have a minimally decent amount of these central capabilities to have a life suited for the human dignity of mankind. Likewise, to have less insufficiency, life would not be going minimally decent. Although Nussbaum creates a threshold on a specific list of central capabilities, Sen argues that these types of lists can actually be culturally imperialistic. In other words, lists can diverge from cultural variations in what is considered to be a minimally decent life, and thus can lead to the centrism of a singular cultural norm or practice. Although Nussbaum acknowledges that her list may not be perfect, she argues it is broad yet specific enough to create a template for measuring poverty based on the capabilities approach. So this raises the question of how we measure poverty. Following the Office of Management and Budget, the U.S. Census Bureau uses a set of money income thresholds that vary by family size and composition to determine who is in poverty. If a family's total income is less than the family's threshold, then that family and every individual in it is considered to be in poverty. This measurement is called the OPM, or the Official Poverty Measure, for the United States. However, we don't think that the OPM should be the official and best way to measure poverty. First of all, the threshold for this measure is set at 3 times the cost of a thrifty food basket created in the 1960s. While this threshold is adjusted for family composition and inflation, it is simply a ridiculous threshold. Times have changed, and households are no longer spending 1/3 of their income on food, but instead the majority of all costs come from housing. There are many other reasons why this measure is outdated. To highlight a few, it doesn't consider non-cash government benefits such as SNAP, free or reduced lunch programs, Medicaid, and housing vouchers, which were all created after this measure, and it also uses the gross annual income, which is not a good measurement because a portion of that gets paid for taxes. We are not alone in thinking the OPM is not the best measure either, because in recent years many new ways to measure poverty have emerged, like the Supplemental Poverty Measure and the Multidimensional Poverty Index. The Supplemental Poverty Measure, also known as the SPM, adds on to the OPM as it considers income as well as all government benefits while also subtracting taxes and other non-discretionary expenses like out-of-pocket health care. The threshold is set at 83% of the median of household expenses spent on food, clothing, shelter, and other utilities, and then adjusted for inflation and household composition. Now, on the other spectrum, departing from assessing poverty on a basis of financial resources, the Multidimensional Poverty Index, also known as the MPI, is based around the capabilities approach. There are 3 main categories: health, education, and standard of living. The MPI measures the multifaceted nature of poverty using a selection of weighted indicators that reflect different types of deprivation, such as nutrition, years of schooling, housing, etc. The MPI works less on an individual level and more on a group analysis to highlight which deprivations cluster together among specific groups so that integrated policies can address the deprivation effectively. This most closely relates to our opinion on how poverty should be measured.
So the question now becomes, how should we measure poverty? We believe that poverty should be measured through the Multidimensional Poverty Index. This method will help us identify people in need to protect their capabilities and provide assistance while still respecting the dignity of humankind. So now the question becomes, how will we do this? Income is not going to be taken into consideration in our measurement of poverty. As previously stated, income alone does not make an accurate indicator of an individual's access to basic resources. Instead, we are proposing a method to measure poverty based around the capabilities approach, focusing on qualities of life and autonomy. What will be taken into consideration are the 3 main factors measured by the MPI, which are education, health, and standard of living, which show an indication of one's general quality of living as well as access to choice. These categories are specifically targeted because being educated, having good health, and having a secure and safe living situation with all of the resources required to sustain this allows for the development of vital internal capabilities that opens the door of choice and control over one's life.
Like Nussbaum, we know our definition of poverty and our list of important capabilities are not perfect. One may argue that our definition is too broad. For example, what constitutes a minimally decent life? How do we get to decide how much capability is enough? These are both valid questions, but it's very important to keep in mind the nuances towards understanding and addressing poverty. How we define and measure poverty is also an indication on how we treat the impoverished and those who are less fortunate. At the end of the day, it is our belief that all people deserve to be treated with dignity and the ability to make choices over their own life. The concept of defining and measuring poverty has many complexities like this, and simply there is not always a clear answer. From our perspectives, this definition and measure are the closest we can come to understanding and addressing poverty while also respecting the dignity and choices of all people. Poverty is something that is fluid and it varies from person to person depending on their situation. To conclude our argument on the importance of human capabilities and the relation of poverty, Amartya quotes, "The good life is partly a life of genuine choice, not one in which the person is forced into a particular life, however rich it might be in other respects." Thank you.